Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, obesity may be on the decline in the USA based on current data. The Department of Health and Human Services has published a monograph on the current state of fluoridation in water and possible effects on cognitive development. The Nobel Prize awards have been published this week, and some of them have been generating more questions than they have answers. A pause button in human embryos might prove useful, particularly around the use in IVF. Greenpeace is being sued, and in turn trying to counter-sue, for their actions across parts of the world, but particularly with regards to the energy company Energy Transfer. We have a interesting Twitter or X post talking about what happens when your CPU has just a minor fault in it, and not necessarily a permanent fault at that, and how it can cause it to do some really bizarre and interesting things. We have the effects that synthetic biology, once touted as the moneymaker and future prospect, has come into hard times because it hasn't really met those same expectations. Applicants in Maryland who wanted to be state police officers are receiving payment for failing tests. And the USA is going to see auroras again this week, due to the coronal mass ejection from last week. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with obesity. Being obese is pretty much an epidemic in the USA. It's thankfully not contagious, as that would be both disgusting and weird, but it is still incredibly prevalent and a major health issue. More or less since 1960 or thereabouts, it's been getting worse and worse. As a result, nearly a quarter of all people in the USA are obese, and nearly 2/3 are at least overweight. This is a really disturbing number when you consider how much harm that can do. We're not just talking about the damage to you from, say, heavy weight on your knees, arms, hips, and so on, but it also has an effect on things like diabetes risk, hypertension risk, cardiovascular disease, and all sorts of other problems that we haven't touched on. And so having 2/3 or possibly more of the US population like that, well, that's a big issue. The solution has come arguably from two different things. The first is perhaps the more important of them. That is the availability of ozempic, which has resulted in a notable drastic drop in the obesity rate. Possibly, and arguably, coupled with the current financial issues, particularly around inflation and the fact that forced dieting may be occurring. Understandably, that is a slight speculation, given that, well, unfortunately, we don't know exactly what every individual who lost weight and is no longer obese has been consuming, but to an extent you kind of have to take that as somewhat granted. The other issue, though, is, well, ozempic. Simply put, that has proven to be an incredibly effective and very efficient way for people to lose weight, far more reliably than other previous attempts. While it's true that this may not seem like much, it could arguably be on par with, say, the reduction in tobacco consumption across the USA in its health benefits, both on an individual scale and at a larger social scale. Shifting to the next item, we have a research article that's been touted as a sort of silver bullet proving that COVID-19 vaccines were terrible because they're causing myocarditis in children. There's a problem with this whole claim, particularly by anti-vaxxers, that, well, that's not what the research was looking at, which is a pretty big problem. So we'll start with the fact that all this research is not peer-reviewed yet. It is entirely preprint, which raises big questions about that, mostly having to do with the fact that, well, the methods and other things haven't been reviewed by people who are able to make a proper judgment on it. But that's, for now, we'll take that as a grant and we'll accept that, hey, maybe they found something significant. And this brings us to the second point. The research was only comparing the rate of myocarditis between those who were vaccinated and those who were unvaccinated, which isn't great because, understand, the whole point of being vaccinated is to reduce the effect and ideally stop the effect, or at least stop infection of COVID-19. As such, worst case scenario, you get fewer cases of myocarditis in those who would be infected that would be caused by COVID. But that's not what they're looking at. Instead, they're looking at whether or not they got it at all. Which, yeah. So they found there were 10 cases in 1 million children, which is actually not that high a number. In fact, it's kind of close to the normal background rate, which is already a concern. The second issue with this conclusion reached by anti-vaxxers is actually the increasing number of vaccines you got, the less likely you were to have myocarditis, which isn't how this should work. If the vaccine is causing it, as is claimed, you should see an increased incidence ratio with an increased number of doses of the vaccine, or boosters thereafter. And no, that's not what happens. It goes down, which is completely contrary to what should occur. So now we have two problems. The next one is, well, you're not comparing it to the actual problem, which is COVID-19 causes far more instances of myocarditis than the vaccine does. The vaccine prevents as many instances from occurring. Therefore, there is a net benefit, simply by reducing the number that will happen. The last point, and this is rather more important, to our mind at least, is that for this study, all the children who were admitted under critical care conditions, that is, taken to the hospital for an emergency, were in the unvaccinated cohort of children, meaning that, well, unvaccinated children are more likely to experience severe myocarditis than vaccinated children, which brings us back to the second point of it provides protection, and therefore the first point as well. So next time you happen to hear someone going on about this study proves that the vaccine is dangerous, no. The vaccine was looking at does it protect you from COVID-19, and coincidentally also came across some data around myocarditis that ultimately doesn't prove anything other than the fact that, yeah, there were some instances, but they were far less significant amongst the vaccinated cohort than the unvaccinated cohort. In the similar conspiracy nut of crap, we have Fluoride, and what is an interesting monograph, but again not necessarily particularly useful, in terms of what's going to happen if you're consuming it, around toxicology for the most part. It's part of the National Toxicology Program, and fundamentally what they've done is a giant literature review. Understand, it's a systemic literature review, which is slightly different, but for now, let's just treat it as one giant literature review to make it simple. What they did was look at all of the available research using certain keywords in search engines. They then aggregated all of these into one individual place, which is great. It makes it much easier to go through and see what studies have found what. But importantly, when you're doing a systematic review, as they have done, you need to weigh, let's say, the various risks and benefits of different studies, mostly around issues to do with bias. By doing that, you can see whether or not, say, research is a good quality, bad quality, somewhere in the middle, and variations on that, more or less. And then you can decide, okay, if there's a whole lot of crappy research out there, well, we're not going to look at that because it's just really bad. But we will look at what's the good research, that is well designed, well conducted, low risk of issues to do with finding results that aren't accurate, and so on. And then they go on and they look at those results only in isolation. It means you're looking at actual good research, and that's what they've done. The issue with that in terms of this is most of that research has been done in the last 20 or so years, so a lot of it is kind of old anyway. But secondary to that, a lot of it is not based in the USA, so the circumstances under which the research is conducted is very different. In fact, you could argue incredibly different. Based on that, the issue now becomes one of, can you compare American results to other countries? For example, India, Pakistan, and other countries again, that are a long way away and very different, and the answer is largely no, but you can take away some results. Some results in this case basically refers to what is the safest level that you could minimally expose someone to, and this is something that's already been established. You're looking at something under 1.5 milligrams per liter, or thereabouts, which isn't all that much. The second thing to look at is what's the dangerous dose, which is arguably the more important. And what they've found is that if you go above 1.5 milligrams a liter, you begin to have concerns, and you do see a negative result. However, in the USA, there's an important thing to this, that is, there is actually a very clear limit on how much can be added to water, and this how much is 0.7 milligrams a litre, as in under half of what's considered dangerous from this study. So, in other words, they found results that apply to anywhere but America, which again is not all that new. We've spoken about this in other videos where some towns have gone along and they had no fluoride in their water. Then they've added fluoride to their water, and they've seen the effects of this. Then they voted to remove fluoride from their water, and then they voted to put it back in the water. So you have a before, during, after, during study. You basically have a cross-sectional or a cross-study where you have cohorts that go off and on the treatment group. And, well, in short, yeah, it's beneficial. It provides a great deal of benefit for kids, particularly, who may not follow oral hygiene all that well. It provides a degree of protection to adults, although not as much. And it does mean that there's a reduction, in broad terms, on the dental health of those individuals. Next, we go on to several news items, all related to Nobel Prizes that have been announced this week. The first is having to do with chemistry, although this is more of a weird and awkward part of it, mostly down to all of the weird intricacies issue that seem to relate to machine learning and the prizes that have been given out, this being the first of them. What the prize in chemistry was given for was to Demis Hassabis, John Jumper, and David Baker for using machine learning to tackle things around 3D proteins and their shape. The key here is that where other researchers have basically had to rely on humans and the idea of an infinite number of monkeys typing on an infinite number of typewriters to get Hamlet, you have instead naked apes typing on their keyboards to get protein and how they're arranged. By doing it with machine learning, they're able to design proteins from scratch, accounting for all the necessary 3D shapes. A rather complicated process, given as said you require infinite naked apes. By being able to use machine learning, you can account for a large number of interactions. To start with, all the individual amino acids and how they interact, hydrogen bonds, sulfide bonds, and more. All of these result in the final contorted and twisted shape of a protein, which can be incredibly complex. And you can see in the background just a few examples of very simple proteins. Understand, these are relatively short and very small and don't involve a lot of interaction, and yet you can somehow make a machine figure out something thousands of times more complex than this. The reason this research is important is not necessarily in and of itself. That is, the research in isolation isn't all that important, but it's what it leads into that becomes so much more important. By being able to know what you need to get as a final result, that is the shape of the protein, this allows you to design it, so you can begin looking at ways of creating proteins that act in different ways. For example, peptides that will bond to certain receptors, something that will act as a kind of antibiotic, something that will fight other diseases, and so on. The next news item is also related to Nobel Prize, and it's with physics this time, but it's again also machine learning, or sort of machine learning anyway. The key here is that, well, with physics, and what it was awarded for is again related very much to AI, but the use of artificial neural networks rather than just machine learning to develop proteins. Artificial neural networks are arguably the next major development in terms of computing power, and you might be confused. Isn't this biology rather than physics? Well, yes, but at least one of the people who's been awarded it has actually trained from both their undergraduate and through to their postgraduate as a physicist. The reason it was awarded for physics in this case is a particular kind of, let's say, a problem called a recurrent neural network, or otherwise called a Hopfield network, and it looks at how a signal spreads or cascades through a certain network and then the effect this has on it. For example, the simplest examples have been things like the spread of a meme within social media. But that's honestly not the best example, it's simply a simple way to do it. The key with this, rather than just being, oh, this is kind of cool, is that it has let's say, a deep history, going back to Boltzmann and the idea of statistical physics. What they've allowed the processing of is that once you have your initial machine being taught these things, you're able to now start developing on that, building on it through deep machine learning. And that's where we are now with things like ChatGPT and similar. And they're not actually AI. They're just very well developed machine learning algorithms. In similar sort of news to that, and more of an observation, it's weird that we have a limited number of Nobel Prizes, but one that they leave out is astronomy. And it would appear, based on anecdotal evidence and apocryphal tales, that it's because Nobel was rather put out with astronomy given his wife had an affair with them. So theoretically, if the individuals involved had had an affair with a physicist, we might have an astronomy award rather than a physics award. Of course, this is all a case of winning a Nobel Prize, and this is where another article from Nature comes into play. It was looking at the networking interaction of Nobel Prize winners and found that a lot of them are uncomfortably and surprisingly incestuous. Not quite, but very similar in terms of the scientific field. It is that most Nobel Prize winners are actually fairly closely related in some way, whether that is being trained by a previous Nobel Prize winner, working in their laboratory, or working for somebody who has. And so the number of steps you take from one Nobel Prize winner to connect them to another Nobel Prize winner is actually quite small. Now, this doesn't sound all that surprising for most people as well. You would think if somebody has won a Nobel Prize, not only would they be able to train a Nobel Prize winner themselves, but that they would be pretty damn good at research, and they are to an extent. It's why they give out such a massive prize worth $1 million. The issue we have with this article is, well, first of all, they complain exceptionally about the fact that a lot of men have won the prizes, and, well, yes, that's because at least 2 of the categories are in scientific fields, which are largely overrepresented, at least if you want to take a pure population spread, by men. As such, it kind of makes sense, and certainly from a historical point of view, it makes sense. This, of course, is changing with time, with an increasing number of women being represented in different ways. But at least from a historical point of view, nobody has denied the value of women with the Nobel Prize. For example, Marie Curie won both physics and chemistry prizes and is one of the only people to do so, or at least only to do so while they're alive, although she didn't live for very long, sadly. The next issue has to do with, well, rather more simply that, well, if you are a Nobel Prize winner, as said, you get $1 million. You've also proven on a very large and very public scale that you're a great researcher. As such, your ability to recruit people who are very skilled and pay them and then do research is going to be that much greater. As such, there is a reason why, with more money and therefore more staff, facilities, and projects going on, you can get more research that leads to more Nobel Prize winners. And this hasn't really changed across the world. It's simply that as time has gone on, we have seen an increasing recognition of more international, that is, mostly outside Europe and North America, researchers, because their research is actually available to be understood. As such, looking at the network as it's being presented by Nature is kind of lopsided and bullshit-like, and we'll have more to say on this later in the video. In news that's slightly more useful, at least in terms of fertility research, we have a molecule that could act as a pause button in human embryonic research. Understand, the idea is not necessarily good or bad, it very much depends on what you're looking at. But the idea is very simple. If you have a developing embryo, and for example you are undergoing IVF, you might be able to undergo treatment and get multiple eggs and then fertilize them and have them reach the blastocyst stage and have them paused, so that if you're in a situation where you either want to get pregnant again or pregnancy fails, you can go through the procedure and fundamentally go straight into pregnancy once more, rather than having to freeze the eggs and have to worry about will they take or not. The research itself is very much based on German bears, which doesn't sound like it should translate very well, but yes, German bears will effectively pause their pregnancy during hibernation in order to ensure when the bears are born, they're born if not when, at least closer to the period of spring when there's more food available. As such, they tried to find the same sort of signal in humans, since humans don't hibernate, obviously, and they did find it. It's a molecule called mTORI, or mTOR inhibitor, and this is supposed to affect rapamycin, and because of that, theoretically, you should be able to use rapamycin to cause the same effect, although it is only effective from this research based on blastoids, which are the very earliest periods of embryonic development, the first, let's say, 5 to 7 or so days. The only other downside to the research at this point is that the hibernation period's actually very short. The treatment only caused hibernation to occur for 8 days. So, theoretically, again, if you're able to then cryogenically freeze the embryo, you could extend that 8-day hibernation almost indefinitely. Unfortunately, this is also only based on animal research, and as such, well, humans are not exactly mice, so the translation is not going to work out great. The next thing we have is more related to bad government decisions and food, or at least food to be, depending on how you look at this. It's the UK and a recent government decision requiring all individuals to register chickens if they keep them. And we're not talking about individual farms or large operations. We're talking about your backyard coop, which is, well, seemingly a overstep for the Britons, who have, responded to this with a great fervour. What they've done is submit every chicken they have ever bought, or at least are buying at the moment, including roast chickens. Yes, all people who are required to register a chicken have done so, including the ones that are, not so much chicken anymore. This has been so impressive with their, malicious compliance, that it has successfully crashed the system, thereby preventing anybody else from being able to submit the required information. In agricultural news of a kind, although this time also related to engineering, it's use of different building materials for bricks, and the idea that potatoes may actually be an incredibly good option. Yeah, it might be weird, but bear with us while we explain this. It's the idea you take your humble potato and you extract the starch from it. You then combine this with either a loon or Martian regolith, that is soil, and a little bit of salt, and you get an excellent brick-making material. Understand it, you can make a lot of potatoes out of a relatively little amount. You can make roughly 25 kilograms of dehydrated potato starch into about 200 bricks, which it's nowhere near enough to build a house, but then again, it's 25 kilograms making 200 bricks and you need roughly 7,500 bricks, so that's somewhere in the ballpark of about 37 times the volume to make a house on Mars. And that of course assumes you want to build something the size of a house here on Earth, rather than just something that you can live in. The research itself is already kind of weird and interesting, and kind of gives rise to the Martian, but more than that, it was compared to other options, and some of the other options are not so obvious. They compared blood and human waste material. Why and how it was thought that using human blood or urine would be a better option is somewhat confusing, but apparently somebody thought it was worth exploring. They've decided that, potatoes are the better option, which a hobbit will tell you that with absolutely no doubt whatsoever. The key here, though, is where they're going to get the human blood, and to an extent where they're going to get the urine, because it's likely that any urine on Mars or the Moon will be recycled and reused in various ways. There's also a certain worry that, using urine and blood, along with potato starch, appears to produce a superior brick to that which is typically available, and, let's not let marketing come into that particular news item. In what is not good marketing, Greenpeace is not only suing, but trying to counter-sue. Greenpeace is basically in trouble for their various activities around the world, and, beyond the fact that they're assholes trying to make children in various developing countries die of either blindness or heart disease, they've done other things, and it includes causing trouble for a US-based energy company called Energy Transfer. What's happened is very simply that they've been sued for their actions around the Dakota pipeline. Now, Greenpeace is arguing that what they've done isn't anything other than just taking part. Energy Transfer is arguing that no, Greenpeace was actively causing this to happen, supporting it and instigating it as a way to not only generate revenue for themselves, but to cause trouble for the company. This is why they're suing them in Dallas, Texas. Now, this is where things get a little bit messy, as Greenpeace is supposed to be based in the European Union, and particularly in the Netherlands. As such, they're trying to use European law, which makes a general blanket protection against something called a SLAP lawsuit, or strategic lawsuit against public participation. And by using this particular, let's say, law, they're trying to overwrite the US court and its jurisdiction. The problem here is sort of twofold. The first is they have a US lawsuit going on separately to the lawsuit that's going on in the Netherlands. Now, there's a strong case to be made that because the US court case has not been, let's say, resolved, the Dutch court can't do anything about it because the US has a very clear position that no, the energy company can indeed take part in this, and as such, they're kind of protected in that respect. Greenpeace is trying to bring Dutch law into play on an American court case, and this is going to be a very messy interaction, where they might be able to get it heard and decided on in the Netherlands, but then if they happen to lose the case in the USA, it would then cost them both for the Dutch case and the American case, and possibly whatever other costs come in the Netherlands case. Of course, we're hoping that they just lose full stop because, as mentioned, Greenpeace is a bunch of assholes. However, there is one other caveat to this whole story, and that's why we're expecting Greenpeace to actually lose this case and then have to deal with the court case in the USA without having this law to protect them. The law they're relying on hasn't actually been brought into law yet. Yeah, it's passed through all the necessary hurdles, but unfortunately at this point, it hasn't actually been made law. As such, it may not actually be able to be applied if, and this is the big if, the court case in USA is already ongoing, in which case they don't have any means to prevent the court case there from happening, nor do they have these SLAP protections that they're trying to apply for. In other environmental news, we have deep-sea vents that are generating energy, but unlike a lot of what you would expect, particularly if you're familiar with the area, is that none of this energy is being generated using life. Rather, it's almost entirely based on chemistry and physics. This is important not so much because we're going to be able to get power out of it, but because it could tell us where life came from. Understand, this kind of reaction and the energy it can produce has two things that are relative. One is that it could be a very primordial version of an ion channel. The second is that because it's generating energy in a local area, this leads to not just thermal heat but actual energy. And that could, because it's a change in voltage, lead to various organic compounds being generated in different ways. So we now have two elements to this that are kind of important. The fact is you can more or less spontaneously generate the various ion channels that we see in any living cell, and also, again, having to do with energy and how energy can be converted and created, thereby leading to, well, cells. Of course, this is entirely based on hydrothermal vents, and as such, there is certain questions about it, but we also, from a general science point of view, think that a lot of early life started in a similar environment, so it would be rational to think that this could be a complex explanation of something that actually has a very simple explanation. Next we have modern technology rather than what could be related to ancient technology. It's how your processor or computer could get something very wrong based on one of its cores playing up. That is, theoretically, it could have a 0 instead of a 1 for some reason, leading to 1 plus 1 equaling 3 rather than 1 plus 1 equaling 2. And admittedly, for your average consumer-based system, this isn't going to matter very much. But then again, your average computer is getting increasingly complex with more and more cores, where a, let's say, Threadripper might have 64 cores and up to 128 threads running at one time. If just one of these cores starts to play up, you might find yourself getting weird results. And according to the ex-host, sheet, tweeter, yes. The effects are actually observed at a large scale, that is, massive server farms, and something called mercurial cores, that is, individual cores that basically play up and create rare problems. The results of this are that, well, you get things like applications crashing, which isn't too bad, as long as you can recover what you're working on. What is less good is silent data corruption, that is, data being corrupted and you have no idea until you try and access it. Live memory being affected, causing applications to start playing up in different ways, or worst of all, possibly kernels getting corrupted. And when that happens, shit gets bad. Going to academic news now, and what is all about, well, arguably representation, but what turns out to be very casual racism in a study about racism. The irony in it is painful. It's a Nature publication that fundamentally looks at the employment of white people and black people, and Hispanic people. You'll notice that there's at least one major demographic missing from that: Asian people. That is because the researchers lumped the Asian people in with white people. Why, you might ask? Who has any idea? They don't really explain it. And yeah, you might think, okay, well, is that all that important? And, well, yeah, it actually is. It's weird. Asian students should theoretically represent a fairly large percentage of university attendance, except most universities also exhibit casual racism in that respect. But despite this, they graduate at high rates and with good degrees, and yet they don't go into academia. But still, they do go into academia, just like everybody else. But they also seem to have a fairly low success rate. The other issue with this is that, well, to a certain extent, other groups do as well. I'm mostly here talking about blacks and Hispanic scholars, but this is not something that's consistent across all universities, all ages, all countries, etc. And that's where this casually racist study about racism is so damn painful. It also doesn't really address other methodological problems. For example, there's no socioeconomic analyses. There's no real history about the individuals. For example, if they're first-generation university graduates who tend to be far worse off in terms of finances and other things. And there are a bunch of other problems with this. Sure, there is no good reason to be racist, but at the same time, there's no point in being racist and then trying to hide it as not being racist when actions speak much louder than words in this instance. Next in academia and research-related news is, to an extent, the slow but certain collapse of synthetic biology, and the problems that, hoping that it will make bank, really haven't come true. It's essentially the same issues around things like, say, vertical farming, artificially grown meat, a lot of tech companies. All of these had major injections of cash early on. And the problem they've faced now is that with that cash drying up, they're not able to make things work. They just can't pay for what they have to pay for, because the marketplace isn't there yet. Compare these very large companies to very small companies, which appear to have achieved a fair amount of success, mostly because where these large companies have had scope creep, and creep is perhaps a very nice word for it given how much it's ballooned, the small companies have remained fairly niche and specific in what they do, meaning that what cash they received was put into achieving that outcome and making that thing happen, meaning that they're solidly ensconced in that particular role. It's worth remembering that these are not a very low-skill role. Most of the people working in here are highly qualified and therefore have to be paid accordingly. You also have very expensive facilities, relatively expensive reagents, and you need to undergo a whole bunch of testing before making these things available. And as such, it costs a lot of money, and if you spread that money over a large number of products, as a lot of these companies have, you just can't keep paying it forever. As such, those that remained on a narrow focus, with a very small number of staff, who were paid well, in a facility that remained relatively stable and wasn't expanded to accommodate a bunch of new stuff, and didn't need to constantly buy in new reagents they weren't familiar with, were able to survive. Going from what is all about money to what is mostly about money, politics, but more a weird observation that it seems that in terms of the upcoming presidential election, whether or not you have a beard may be a factor. Now, this is based on American politics, but it's true in other countries as well. For example, if you didn't have a mustache in the early 1900s in the UK, you may not be elected because a mustache was necessary, until they had total war, at which time, somehow or other, the rigor and structure of having a mustache was not needed. But then you have Russia, on the other hand, where if you were bald, you were likely to be elected in the last open election, and that there was a cycle between having a full head of hair and being bald, and that it was necessary to go between these in order to ensure you went in to be elected at the right time, because if you were a bald man running during an election that you weren't suitable for, you were not going to win. In other US politics, although this time more political in that it's somewhat controversial than it is actual politics, it has to do with Maryland and the fact that female and black applicants who failed the state police tests are now getting back paid and being allowed to try again because the Department of Justice and Maryland State Police have settled a lawsuit. Understand, these tests were not complicated. They were fairly simple. Things like, if you work between X time and Y time, how much time have you worked? If you take a list of items, what is the average price of this list? What is the most expensive item? Very fundamental test items. The other part of it that was considered discriminatory was a fitness test, which, well, it's a fitness test, given that they're going to be police, and at least part of that will involve a variety of physical activities. Kind of makes sense you'd want them to be at least somewhat fit. The fact that there was a disproportionate number of females who were failing the fitness test, okay, there's some questions about that, but it's not necessarily wrong. But the actual written test? Yeah, no, that one's nonsense. Mostly because mathematics, reading comprehension, grammar, and report writing skills kind of important for police. So being able to pass that with at least 70% doesn't seem that unreasonable. The solution that's come out from the settlement is they're going to change their testing format. Not necessarily the physical testing, but definitely the written testing, because apparently being able to do basic math and respond to questions and understand what's written is just too hard. The final news item we have for you this week is all about the aurora that's coming through. So we were meant to have one this last week due to a coronal mass ejection. That's basically a giant solar flare. And we're meant to have more this coming week, with the most recent solar ejection sometime around the 10th of October, leading to a very nice display in most parts of the world. Which parts of the world exactly will vary somewhat, but at the moment we're expecting to see it covering a fair amount of Canada and North America, although if you're in the lower states, probably not. If you are concerned though, and there is some reason to be, you may find that the effects of this will be felt in other ways. For example, some US farmers may experience disruption to their GPS system, since this will affect things like satellites. So yes, that giant ball of fire in the daytime sky that you can't see at night will have a huge effect on what you actually see at night, mostly having to do with bright green and reddish hues. That's all the news for this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.